Good evening and good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to viewers from around the world for this live stream discussion we've entitled Qin Gang Out, Where is China's Foreign Policy Headed? I'm Gill, the Executive Director of the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and it is a pleasure and privilege to moderate our discussions today on this topic with a stellar panel from the Center for China Analysis. Before turning to them, just a few quick comments. Developments in the past couple of weeks in relation to the former Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang have been nothing short of remarkable in many respects, and yet, especially for those of us who have followed elite politics in the People's Republic of China for a long time, we can also see a lot of familiar reflections from times past, telling us more about the nature of the party and its political system than about any particular individual circumstances of those at or near the top. We're going to dive into these issues in just a minute. I want to remind our viewers that they should feel free to submit your questions via the link to the Q&A form that is included in the event description on your platforms, Facebook and YouTube, that you are now viewing. We'll do our best to get to as many of these questions that you submit as we can. So let's dive in. To unpack and analyze these developments, we have three outstanding experts who are going to share their thoughts and insights. We have Rorry, a senior fellow at the Center for China Analysis, and also in her day job, she's the managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Chris Johnson joining us. He's also a senior fellow on Chinese politics with the Center for China Analysis, but he's also the president and CEO of China Strategies Group, a political risk consulting firm, and was formerly a senior China analyst in the U.S. intelligence community. Last and certainly not least, we're also joined by Neil Thomas, a fellow on Chinese politics with our center, where among other roles, he leads the work for one of our flagship products, the highly popular interactive website known as Decoding Chinese Politics. And we encourage all of you to check that out if you've not already done so. All right, let's get started. I thought I'd start with a round for all three of you with just a basic question to get your take. Let's start with this. What do you think just happened in relation to Qin Gang and why? And Neil, I'd like to start with you.
Thanks, Bates. I thought I'd first just go over the facts of what has transpired over the last few days to kind of ground the conversation. So on Monday, it was announced that the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, which is China's legislative body, its parliament, would meet on the Tuesday, a very unusual kind of emergency session being called only one day in advance. The topic was to discuss an amendment to the criminal law, but also to deal with certain appointments and removals. So the Standing Committee met on Tuesday as planned, and indeed the main outcome was that it removed Qin Gang as foreign minister and it replaced him with Wang Yi, who is the top diplomat. He sits on the Politburo, the top 24 member body of the Communist Party. He was the foreign minister from 2013 to late 2022. He was Qin Gang's predecessor. So he replaced Qin Gang in that role, but Qin Gang was retained in his role as state councillor, which is a higher ranking role. It's more inward focused, and it's a role that the NPC Standing Committee does have the power under a recent amendment to its organic law to appoint and remove, and it didn't do that. So that was basically the outcome of the meeting, and we didn't really get any more information from the party or from state media beyond that. A few things that were picked up were that Qin Gang wasn't removed from all his roles. He was formally, quote, removed rather than dismissed, kind of a linguistic difference in the party's wording of what it did to his position as foreign minister that suggests he hasn't been, a political investigation to him hasn't concluded yet. Shortly after the announcement, he was removed. Many of his speeches and activities disappeared from the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which seemed very unusual. But it transpired that only a few hours ago, many of those activities have now reappeared on the websites, causing a lot of speculation and confusion about whether this pointed towards a political explanation for Qin Gang's removal, or whether it meant there was actually kind of a health issue that was sidelining him temporarily or perhaps permanently, and that's why he kept his other roles. But there have been persistent rumors that Qin Gang is caught up in some kind of political scandal, potentially involving an extramarital affair with a Chinese journalist, which potentially led to him being compromised by various intelligence services. That's all currently speculation, but it notably hasn't been censored, or hasn't been as censored as you would expect on Chinese social media. And there's still been no further explanation about where Qin Gang is, what his health status is, what his political status is, coming from the Chinese government since he was last seen on the 25th of June, just over a month ago now, when he's meeting with a Vietnamese counterpart. There were one or two occasions where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson said that it was health reasons that had kept Qin Gang from fulfilling his duties over the past few weeks. That was a little while ago now. It's something that's been used before as an excuse when officials have been purged. And it's also quite likely that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is somewhat in the dark about where Qin Gang is and what his situation is. It's kind of at a political level, it seems, that's elevated far beyond them. It's not known as to be a particularly powerful ministry, and Qin Gang is certainly not part of Xi's true inner circle. So that's, I think, a snapshot of most of what we actually know, plus some of the major explanations at the moment. And I'll leave it there, and I'll get into the discussion later.
Thanks so much, Neil. Great background, and really helpful in understanding where we are now. So Chris, unusual, not so unusual?
I think it's pretty unusual. Yeah, I think we could definitely say it's unusual. And I guess there's a few more things just to add to Neil's list that we know, right? The first is that it's a mess, right? And we've got things going up and down on websites, and we've got longstanding, uncomfortable, awkward commentary by foreign ministry spokespersons, and dodging, by Xie Feng, the new ambassador to Washington, D.C. out at the ASPI strategy forum, I guess last week, in response to sort of questions about this and so on. So we know it's kind of messy. We also know it's pretty high level. The decision obviously came out of the Politburo meeting that just occurred on Monday. And that was, mainly about the Politburo's review of H1 economic performance. But of course, it always has that wonderful phrase at the end of every readout of a Politburo meeting, and other matters were discussed. And it seems this matter was discussed. So I think that's important. And I think we know there was a sense of urgency to deal with it. We had a situation where the NPC Standing Committee, as Neil said, decided to hold this meeting. They dressed it up a bit by, just making some commentary around a draft law as well to make it look a little more normalized for an NPC Standing Committee session. Of course, it was about things like bribery and so on, the criminal law that they were discussing, so that may not have been coincidental. But most importantly, it was called in a day, right? And the NPC's own regulations indicate that a minimum of 7 days are required typically in a non-emergency situation for them to be able to hold one of these meetings. So that tells us it's an emergency situation. So, I think that's another piece that we know. So that's all, I think, very important to sort of keep in mind. And I think, to some degree, the the move of Wang Yi over probably as a placeholder, although I'm sure we'll get more into that, to stabilize things, but also that they sent a Politburo level official over there, right? Which is something that they've done in the past when we have issues other than health, political issues. And it's hard for me to believe this is health. Of course, the CCP is wonky about health issues, and so on. They're very careful about these things. And when Yang Jiechi, until recently the top diplomat and Politburo member in Wang Yi's position, had a massive heart attack in the United States as when he was ambassador to Washington, he was not seen for a goodly while. But we didn't have social media or any of these sort of things that we have now, right, to be able to sort of determine. So it wasn't noticed as much, I think, at that time. In terms of the various rumors, I mean, I'm with Neil. There's a lot of stuff out there. I would just exercise my former hat to indicate I'm very doubtful that this is a situation of either the British, US, or other allied intelligence services using what the Russians would call compromat against Qin Gang. In my experience, Western services don't tend to use that tactic, in part because you get a very unreliable source when they're being blackmailed most of the time. So I find that hard to believe. The issue with the CCTV reporter seems much more believable. I mean, there's some crazy elements here. The tweeting that she did, of course, this revelation that the photo that's hanging in the Chinese embassy, which was still hanging as of a night or two ago of Qin Gang, is sort of excerpted from an interview that he did with this lady, which is, really quite interesting. And unfortunately for women's rights in China, there's a long history of senior officials sort of taking on these newsreaders as paramours. Jiang Zemin was legendary for it when he was president, at times having multiple of them going. And in my former capacity, we knew of several of these, sort of situations. So it's not uncommon. So in my mind, that doesn't stretch credulity too much. And then just real quickly before turning it over to Rorry, one thing that we've seen in a lot of the commentary is that the suddenness and the opacity around this, is somehow a reflection of what some analysts have called the volatility of, Uber Xi Jinping, right? And then implying that we would not have seen this in the past. My sense is that's just not true. In the past, we had actually surprising, opaque, and volatile purges of much more senior leaders than a minister, a Politburo member. So obviously, famous case of Bo Xilai in 2012, which was quite volatile. The purge of Chen Qitong as Beijing secretary in 1995 by then President Jiang Zemin, and the purge of the Shanghai Party secretary Cheng Liangyu in 2006 by Hu Jintao. So we've seen this movie before, and I think that speaks to the fact that this is something that's sort of innate to these kind of systems, right? Everyone is fine until they're not fine. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Chris. Great readout, great insights. Rorry, what's your take on all of this?
Yeah, I think I'll build on what my colleagues have said by talking a little bit about not just what happened, but why we don't know what happened. And the reason we don't know what happened is because the issue of elite politics in China is one that's closely guarded at the very top. And that's a feature of the system that I think needs to be unpacked and explored through the example of Qin Gang's abrupt removal as foreign minister. The fact is that it almost doesn't really matter if he was removed for health reasons, for corruption reasons, because he either endangered national security or was involved in an incident like the ones that Chris mentioned that would have embarrassed the party, would have embarrassed the leadership. The fact is that we mere mortals are not supposed to know what is going on at the highest levels of Chinese politics. And that's a feature of the system, as Chris said, that has been around for a really, really long time. And it's exemplified by the events of the last 2 weeks. I think it is, likely as well that there are elements to Xi Jinping's relationship that Qin Gang that make this particularly tight, that make this a particularly tight information environment. China, even though it had purged other officials in the past, we typically did know a little bit more about those situations as they developed than we do about this one. And it's certainly clear that Qin Gang is seen, at least by outsiders, as directly tied to Xi Jinping, that Xi Jinping is seen as promoting Qin Gang up through the leadership, perhaps over other people who would have had more typical qualifications for the job. So I do think there's a linkage here between the tightness of the information environment, Qin Gang's leaks to Xi Jinping, and the overall information environment in Xi Jinping's China. Certainly not something that is unique to Xi Jinping's China or to China in general, but something that has tightened up over the course of Xi Jinping's tenure. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Rory, and thanks also to Chris and Neil. Look, what you've done, I think, is great because I think it helps our viewers and the broader watching audience out there kind of separate the wheat from the chaff a bit. This has been a really fun parlor game for lots of us to speculate, but it's your deeper insights about what are some of the reliable signals that we're getting to help us get a little closer to what is probably going on. But at the end of the day, it's still a lot of speculation, a lot we don't know. So what I'd like to do, sort of move on from what happened and why, more directly focused on Qin Gang's circumstances. And let's talk a little bit more broadly about what the implications might be going forward in two particular areas. One, does this signal any sort of rumblings, difficulties, challenges going forward within the domestic political scene in China? That's one sort of area I'd like to hear from you. Secondly, and more broadly, what does this tell us about foreign policy? Can we expect changes there? Relations with the outside world, China's image, and so forth. Let's start with the first of those two, impact on Chinese elite politics. Rory, let me turn to you first and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, what the situation shows is that politics don't stop just because it seems as though Xi Jinping is in charge of all of China and all of the Chinese bureaucracy. There's certainly, people in elite circles in China that may have been displeased by Qin Gang's promotion and therefore may have had reason to bring to light information about him that was unsavory. I mean, that's all assuming, of course, that he was removed for disciplinary reasons or corruption reasons. I think another thing that it does show that the appointment of Wang Yi shows, which is relevant to elite politics, but also to foreign policy, is that we really have to be careful about how we think about the foreign ministry. The thought leadership of China when it comes to its foreign policy and its domestic policy sits with the party. And the foreign ministry is an implementing body. It's not a decision-making body. So in some ways, it is relevant to both the elite politics conversation and the foreign policy conversation to talk a little bit more about Wang Yi and who he is. He's someone who has held implementing positions before, but he's also someone who is, we believe, in Xi Jinping's inner circle. And so in some ways, you could argue that Wang Yi's appointment as Qin Gang's successor signals that Xi Jinping believes that foreign policy is going to be a major, important topic, subject, and the developments in foreign policy are going to be critical to China's success. If they just needed another figurehead to be in charge, they could have found one. And I'm not suggesting that Qin Gang was just a figurehead, but if they needed an implementer to be in charge, they could have found one. The fact that Wang Yi is moving into this position suggests to me that foreign policy is a really high priority in Chinese elite politics, and particularly in Xi Jinping's upcoming agenda.
Thanks, Rory. Well, that's an interesting take. What do you think, Chris? How do you read these recent events as their implications, in relation to the larger picture of Chinese elite politics?
Yeah, well, I think Rory's spot on in her commentary with regard to sort of the role of the MFA, and I'm intrigued by her thoughts on Wang Yi. That's certainly an interesting way to think about it. He is obviously trusted by Xi Jinping. I mean, I think one thing that's been interesting is there'll be, of course, an instinct to sort of say, well, this reflects poorly on Xi Jinping's judgment, for pushing Qin Gang, right, over perhaps, as Rory said, more qualified people. I think that's fair to say. The question is it meaningful, right, in terms of the elite political game? My sense is we're not in an era where there were sort of competing factions of roughly equal strength, where, you know, we're about to go into Bei Dai He season, right? And in the past, if there is something like this, you might see another sort of faction using that against their rivals to either damage them or to seek concessions in some way or another. We don't get the sense that that really happens these days. You know, my sense is, of course, Xi Jinping has detractors, and I'm sure they're relishing every moment of this and enjoying a good snigger, but they'll be doing so very quietly, would be my sense. It's also important to think about how this gets handled. You know, Xi Jinping's pretty smart guy in my experience, and a political tactical genius as well. And so depending on what exactly he's in trouble for here, if it is corruption, I think it's easy enough for Xi Jinping to be able to tell his colleagues, look, this demonstrates, I don't care what stable, you know, a senior official is in, if they're corrupt, they're out. Unlike my predecessors, Jiang Zemin tolerated Jia Qinglin and a whole series of other exceptionally corrupt people, not only let them continue serving in their offices, but promoted them, you know, through the ranks over time. Likewise, Hu Jintao with his sort of chief of staff, Ling Jihua, and the former vice president of the UN, Chao, and others who were egregiously corrupt, you know, and allowed to sort of stay in place. So it all depends, I think, on how Xi Jinping is able to do this. I think what it does tell us, though, is that there is an issue, as Rorry was pointing out, of, you know, Uberlord Xi, right? So when you have a situation where a guy like Qin Gang has clearly been allowed to jump the queue, you know, over more qualified people. And something we haven't discussed in my mind is that of all the ministries in my mind in China, this goes back to Zhou Enlai's day, the MFA is arguably the most hierarchical. So in other words, until very recently, they had been largely immune from Xi Jinping's precedent smashing nonsense, you know, I guess you could put it. And that changed with Qin Gang, right? So I think that's a significant change that we have to be mindful of. Likewise, the fact that they were so close, people were probably saying, we got to wait for the boss to show a smoke signal as to direction here, you know, before we decide what to do. So we had this incredibly long and awkward, embarrassing, you know, absence of his. You know, the state councilor situation and this on and off website and all of that, you know, it does suggest there is a faint hope that there is probably something, you know, legitimately health-wise going on with him. But you'd think it'd be easy enough for them to be able to, you know, show a photo of him convalescing or something if that's what was really going on. You know, my sense is we'll find that it is discipline. And again, my view is Xi Jinping can probably write it out. What it is an unwelcome headache for him, given all the other challenges that he's facing. And it does suggest that his third term has not gotten off to the smoothest beginning. I think you're on mute, Bates.
We're talking about potential rumblings, then some sniggering in the background, as you say, but unlikely to be highly disruptive at the highest levels, certainly in terms of Xi Jinping's abilities to maintain his control, and he might even be able to turn it to a positive, as you say. Neil, what is your thoughts on this? How do you read these developments in relation to the upper reaches of power in China?
Yeah, just to really echo what Chris and Rorry have been saying, I think that it's not going to have a huge impact on the status quo of Chinese elite politics. Something that Xi, I mean, he's a powerful enough a boss that one, either unloyal or incapacitated, employee is not going to, be enough to cause any kind of threat to his leadership. I think that the actual impact of this removal on Chinese elite politics could be fairly minimal. I mean, just to extend the kind of a thought experiment. I mean, if we don't know exactly what happened to Qin Gang. I mean, if this was a capricious change of Xi Jinping's view about an underling for no real good reason, which is possible, that is potentially something that would be more significant. And that might be something that starts happening more often in Xi's third term. This is, again, pure speculation. But if indeed this is the beginning of more regular purges of higher level people in the party, that's when it could actually become more significant, because you just have the situation where even being an ally of Xi, someone who's known him in the past, someone who's demonstrated loyalty to him, who seems to be in his favor, if even those types of people start getting purged more often, perhaps for no discernible reason apart from Xi's favor, then you get a kind of a chilling effect across the top of the party, and when everyone kind of be more fearful of their position, no one feels safe. That's when you really kind of get more either overzealous implementation of small things Xi says, and kind of total paralysis policy-wise on anything else. And that's what could actually start destabilizing the current equilibrium in China's elite politics. I'm not saying that's likely to happen. My best guess would be that whatever Qin Gang did, or whatever he's experiencing, is a kind of one-off event related to him personally and things he's done or is perhaps suffering. But in terms of what would actually matter a bit more, at least for thinking about the political and perhaps policy trajectory of Xi's third term and beyond, it would, I think, only be if we started seeing this happening a lot more.
Just to build on that, Bates, real quickly, I think, though, it is very important what they do next. If this is allowed to just kind of go on with no official explanation for too terribly much longer, whether it's actually what's happening behind the scenes or not, a lot of elite cadre are going to start having those sweats that Neil is talking about, and I think that is destabilizing for them. Now, sometimes we see from Xi Jinping, he kind of likes it when people are sweating. And, there's an element of that. And there's obviously a lot of comparisons at times between he and Mao Zedong. And of course, that was one of Mao's favorite pastimes, was to make his subordinates nervous. But it seems to me they've got to speak up, in relatively quick order. Yes, discipline, inspection, investigations take a relatively long time sometimes, but you would think they would have had their ducks relatively in a row, before removing him. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. And my sense is they've got to say something in the next couple of weeks. When Bo Xilai fell, it was very quick. It was announced he was removed as the Chongqing party secretary, and it was either the next day or certainly within 48 hours that, the slew of accusations came out against him and so on. So be very interesting to see what they do next.
And I suppose it would make some sense that might occur before the Beidai meetings that you referenced, the annual leadership confab on the coast. So perhaps we'll be seeing something coming up relatively soon. I very much agree that some explanation has to come out. And what's interesting about this conversation, of course, is that I think also already referenced is that even within the the leadership itself, even within relatively senior people of the foreign ministry, there may well be a similar sort of speculation and ignorance about what's going on, even at that level, which again speaks volumes about the system.
There's a reason why Xie Feng and every other ambassador across the world has gone dark in their Twitter spaces and so on. They've gotten very quiet in the last few days.
Yeah,
even the most prolific ones.
One other, before we turn to the broader question of how this might be affecting China's external relationships, I want to get a quick round here. We had a question coming across earlier, speculating whether or not Qin Gang was seen as too pro-American. Does that make any sense to you, Neil or Rorry?
I don't think that Qin Gang was seen as particularly pro-American. I mean, my understanding is that he didn't have a very good reception in Washington, and was not seen as someone who built a lot of deep U.S. relationships. I find the idea that this has to do with the policy difference between Qin Gang and the top Chinese leadership a little bit difficult to swallow. This is not the type of action that I think would normally be taken in the case of a policy difference. If there was a policy difference, someone might be called out for a couple of weeks to talk to the Chinese leadership about correcting their position, but unlikely to be summarily removed from their post with such little explanation. Again, as Neil said, maybe this is a new feature and we'll have to wait and see on that. But from my perspective, I don't think that there was any policy difference about the US or otherwise that would have led to this level of scrutiny on Qin Gang, his removal. And the reason is because this does not look good to the outside world. I disagree with my colleagues a little bit that international curiosity is going to prompt Xi Jinping and the leadership in Beijing to give us an explanation for what is happening. I don't think that, that's something that really motivates the Chinese leadership. But I do think that this is an incident that does remind the world about the deep opacity in the Chinese system, and it might inject a little bit of nervousness about whether or not the person we're talking to as an official in one country to an official in China is a reliable person and is someone who can, comfortably make, commitments on behalf of Beijing. So while it's not good, I'm just not sure that, international curiosity is going to be the prompt that allows us to get more information.
Well, that was a brilliant segue, Rorry, to talk about the issues about, the international implications of this. Before we get to that, I want to just remind our viewers once again that you're more than free to submit your questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. That would be via the link to the question and answer form that is included in the event description on the platform that you are currently viewing, and we'll try to get to those. But just to turn back to the panel briefly, let's think a little bit more about the international implications that that Rorry has just brought up for us. I wanted to turn first to you, Chris, and maybe think about this in two levels. But you're welcome to respond as you like. But there are the broader questions of image, reliability, who and what kind of country are we dealing with here? But then I suppose it might also have some impact on specific issues. So I don't know if you think it's going to matter, for example, in terms of relations with Ukraine, with the United States, with Russia, with the global South. And I suppose it might matter also when we start speculating about who might be the successor after Wang Yi, presuming that Wang Yi is not going to hold this, for an extended period of time.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think both those levels obviously matter a lot. Just to sort of amplify a few of Rorry's comments, for me, I agree with her 100%. I don't think the leadership gives a fig about what international observers think. I was thinking more of the domestic audience will want to know what's going on here, sort of in response to some of the and it grinds the gears to a halt, right? And foreign embassies and so on. So the leadership needs to provide some sort of sense, what's happening. Presumably the MFA is sending cables to their embassies, but they're probably pretty vague, would be my guess at this stage. I guess the other thing that Rorry raised, which I think is super important, is this whole issue of reliability of ministers. This is a feature, not a bug, of Xi Jinping's leadership. This has been going on since the very beginning when he rewired the system, right, to sort of take what used to be solid lines in the system and make them dashed lines, right, by creating all these new leading groups that then became commissions and so on and so forth. I mean, there was a time and a place where if you went to a minister and that person, a decision that was in that person's wheelhouse was happening, that person should be able to speak authoritatively to what policy would be. I can tell you in my personal experience, I've had that not happen a few times, very embarrassingly for that person. So, this is a significant issue that I think we confront. In terms of the impacts on overall foreign policy, well, and then the other point I would just say, anyone who thinks Qin Gang was pro-US clearly has never had a meeting with Qin Gang. But, my sense is that it will have a minimal impact. I mean, to what Rorry said earlier, the foreign ministry is largely an implementing body. Xi Jinping runs foreign policy. That's very clear. And also, because Qin Gang in some ways was so inexperienced for the position he held, he doesn't really have, a particular policy area, right, where he was strong. I mean, he was never an ambassador before he showed up in Washington. He had not served in international multilateral organizations like Ma Jiaoshu, his deputy, has. and so on and so forth. So he doesn't probably have strong policy views that he was articulating, other than trying very hard to sing from the hymnal of Xi Jinping, right? So therefore, my sense is there probably won't be too much impact on the various areas that you suggested. Where we might see a slight blip is in the area of this effort to sort of stabilize U.S.-China relations, right? Because, of course, Qin Gang was supposed to visit Washington relatively soon. And my understanding is there are lots of debates inside the administration, voices also coming from the Hill, that the U.S. has been decamping a series of very senior officials to China, where the Chinese deign to see them, but offer them very little, right? And so there's a certain pressure building for some reciprocity, that a senior Chinese official should come to Washington so as to avoid charges for the administration of, being the supplicant to Emperor Xi Jinping, right? And I think this is very much a dynamic in Washington right now. Qin Gang was supposed to solve that problem, and now he won't. So will they quickly have Wang Yi trot his way over here, and how do they align that given the kind of Wang Yi to Jake Sullivan more senior relationship that had been established already? It's very messy. I don't think it derails the process or anything like that, but it's bloody inconvenient, in that regard for the current efforts to sort of stabilize the relationship. In terms of other foreign policies, I think it certainly does cause a lot of foreign countries and governments to sort of say, who do we invest in this government aside from Xi Jinping? We can't get access to Xi Jinping most of the time. So who do we invest in terms of trying to build relationships? And how do we know next week they're not going to be purged? I mean, I think that is fundamental, because diplomacy is always based on trust, right? And the ability to build up relationships over time. And something like this throws a pretty significant wrench in that process.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. Great insights as always. And Neil, I'd love to hear your take on what all this might mean for the broader issues of China's image, and maybe on some specific issues.
Yeah, I'd basically just reinforce what Chris has been saying. I think the overall impact on Chinese foreign policy is unlikely to be very large. It is, I think, interesting, as Rorry was saying, that, Wang Yi is a Politburo member, so they're putting someone pretty senior in there. And Wang Yi is a bit closer to the policymaking process as the director of the Communist Party's Central Foreign Affairs Office. That's the kind of role that he inhabits on the Politburo. Ultimately, still, Xi Jinping and the kind of really close inner circle around him that are making the final calls about big picture foreign policies. But I think that the kind of impact on the actual content of those policies is likely to be fairly minimal. And I think that the fact that Wang Yi's there is probably to take up another kind of part of the questions that you had, as probably also likely to be, in my view at least, to be a temporary arrangement. So that kind of goes to what Chris was saying about who do we invest in? I mean, you should be investing in Wang Yi if you can get him, because he is a more senior diplomat than the foreign minister. But I imagine that Wang Yi will kind of spearhead this efforts at the implementation level to stabilize U.S.-China relations. He may well visit to set up the preparations for Xi Jinping's likely trip to the United States in November for the APEC summit in San Francisco. I mean, that risks turning into a political circus in the United States, given the kind of temperatures around U.S.-China relations and attitudes towards Xi personally in the United States. So there's strong interest, I think, in Beijing to manage that well, to be able to paint it as a success, to avoid embarrassment. I think Xi has a interest as well domestically to be able to show that he can manage U.S.-China relations well, within his own party and leadership too. So I think that probably is more likely than not to happen. Seeing Wang Yi come over to try and make sure that process proceeds smoothly. Because even if you don't want to give anything to the United States on climate change or debt in the developing world, you can't avoid the fact that APEC, which she always goes to, with the exception of COVID, is in the United States this year. So he basically has to go. So I think that maybe Wang Yi is replaced at the next full session of the National People's Congress in March, perhaps. And because he's doing the job of two people, which can only do for so long without kind of straining China's diplomatic capacity. Because I mean, the protocol is important in terms of, who you can meet. I think that was one of the reasons that whatever's happening with Qin Gang, if he's in trouble, if he's got health issues, why do you replace him as foreign minister, but not as state counselor? Because the foreign minister thing just matters from a very practical point of view. Like the British foreign minister had to cancel a meeting with his Chinese counterpart recently because there just wasn't a counterpart for him to meet with. And you don't want to meet someone who's more junior than you. You're not going to get a meeting with someone more senior. Those are sensitive political calculations. So now Wang Yi is he is a counterpart for people at that level in other countries, so they can proceed with those meetings. But he also has his other job to do. So that's, I think, my view why it might not last for the next 4 years till the next Party Congress.
Yeah, hard to believe that it would. And maybe in a little while we could get into some thinking about who might then be coming along to take up this role down the track. But I want to hear from Rorry as well. Get some further thoughts from you, Rorry, about the where we're going in the next 4 or 5 months with this change with Wang Yi in place. How do you see it affecting important elements of China's foreign policy and foreign relations?
Yeah, well, I think Wang Yi is really a brilliant choice to replace Qin Gang for all of the reasons that Neil and Chris just outlined. I mean, if you need somebody who has relationships, Wang Yi has the relationships to move the foreign policy along. If you need someone to go cable all the diplomats and say, hey, proceed as business as usual and don't ask me any more questions, Wang Yi is certainly the person who could do that. But I also think that, Wang Yi is also deeply steeped in major power relationships. So whether that's between the US and China, Russia, China, Europe, China, Wang Yi has the type of relationships and experience that really allows him to be a good interlocutor and implementer of foreign policy in the months ahead. There's also the non-inconsequential issue of Taiwan. And one piece of Wang Yi's longtime portfolio that I think will come to bear, particularly in the next several months leading up to the January 2024 Taiwan election, is that Wang Yi was the head of the Taiwan Affairs Office, the implementing body for Chinese Taiwan policy, just before he became foreign minister. And not only was he the head of this office, but he was the head of the office at the high point for cross-Taiwan Strait relations. So during the time that Wang Yi was in charge of the Taiwan Affairs Office, there was the signing of the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement between the two sides, ECFA, which really defined the cross-strait trade relationship and still does. There was the kind of using the basis of the 1992 consensus, this idea that both sides agree that there's one China, but they have different interpretations as to what that one China looks like or who governs it, as the basis for all kinds of exchanges, party-to-party exchanges, other exchanges. So Wang Yi has this really deep knowledge of Taiwan, and even some of the key Taiwan political players who might be potentially, playing a part in this election are people that that were in politics at that time. People like Lai Ching-te, who is the candidate for the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP. So, and it's not only that there's this important Taiwan election coming, it's that in that intervening period when Wang Yi was foreign minister, the Taiwan issue has become so internationalized. I don't think that there's ever been a meeting, in the history of US-China relations where the Chinese foreign minister didn't start with his US counterpart by saying, Taiwan is a part of China and I need you to adhere to the one China principle. That's not new. What is new is that this has not just become a phrase of art that China needs to say over and over again to the United States. It now needs to say it to Japan. It needs to say it to Korea. It needs to say it to the UK. It needs to say it to France and to all of these other countries that have expressed concern about peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. we don't know what's going to happen in January 2024, but it's likely that whoever comes to power in Taiwan is going to be dealing with the instability in a cross-strait situation, probably at the lowest point that it's been in many, many years. And having Wang Yi in the room with his foreign counterparts, giving the Chinese narrative, deeply understanding the issues, understanding the players involved is going to be a really invaluable asset for China in this period ahead. Similarly, just last point on APEC, this is a forum to which Taiwan is invited. Taiwan is an economy member of APEC. So I think one reason that China must be, quite invested in getting Xi Jinping into the November summit at APEC is that it does create a power play against whatever Taiwan representative is there. Now, Taiwan would never send its president to APEC. It always sends a private sector official representing the head of the Taiwan delegation. But the fact is that you could imagine situations if the Chinese president is not in the room, that the Taiwan, delegation would have more and more opportunities to meet with their counterparts to create a media narrative that Taiwan is being treated really well at the summit. And Beijing is absent. So I think all of these reasons, really point to why it's important to have Wang Yi in this position now, and why he may very well stay past January 2024 and into the intervening period in order to properly handle the Taiwan issue at this time.
Wow, thanks, Rorry. That's all really interesting. I mean, I think we all agree that, of the possible choices, there's probably no doubt that Wang Yi makes all the sense in the world, for all the reasons you explained, both political and just experiential. But in the few minutes we have left, I know that our viewers would be keen to get your thoughts, at least to speculate if this is just a stopgap measure. Let's just assume it is for the sake of the conversation. I'd love to get some closing thoughts from all of you. Then, drawing from what you know about elite connectivity, elite connections, elite relationships, loyalties at the top, drawing from what you think you know about how Xi Jinping likes to pick his people, and layering into that what you know about the actual experience and background of potential successors to Wang Yi to take up the foreign ministry position on a more permanent basis. Do you care to maybe name some names or think about what you think is going to be important in Xi Jinping's mind as he thinks through whether or not to give the job to somebody else other than Wang Yi? Let me start with you on that, Neil, and then go to Chris and Rorry, and we'll wrap up.
Sure, thanks, Bates. Well, I've already put some potential names to paper, so it's too late to go back on that. In the spirit of speculation, though, I must say, the first thing to remember is Xi Jinping has bent or broken a host of the previous norms around promotions and retirement ages that used to provide a more reliable guide to potential candidates for higher office. And I think the 20th Party Congress was a great example of this. And Wang Yi himself is an example of this. He was supposedly too old to stay on the Politburo under, kind of a 20-year-old or so norm that had operated since 2002. He turned 69, but it was meant to be if you were 68 or older, you retired. He didn't retire. He was, granted an exception because he's, probably seen as the only person who is politically reliable and professionally capable enough for the job. And I think those are kind of the two main criteria, if you like, that would be floating around Xi Jinping's mind. You need someone has some diplomatic chops, because this is a fairly specialized job, but also someone who you totally trust, especially if there's just been some kind of spying or political reliability scandal that has brought down Qin Gang. That would be very much top of mind. I mean, it is worth remembering that I think it is possible that Qin Gang returns to office as foreign minister. It's not my base case, but if indeed he is unwell, which is still a possibility, then maybe he needs 2 or 3 months to recover, and then he's back, he's fighting fit, and they just swap him back in at another meeting of the MPC Standing Committee. That's not impossible. right? So he could be back. It would be a pretty stunning kind of reversal of many of the narratives we're building up around the event, but it's possible, and it's important to remember that. But assuming that Qin Gang is in some kind of political trouble and he's not going to return as foreign minister, or he's maybe too sick to return as foreign minister, he has a long-term health issue, then if we're looking at this combination of people who have some experience, some serious experience in diplomacy and who are politically close to Xi, I mean, the name that kind of rises to the top of my list, not necessarily as an overwhelming favorite, but if I had to pick anyone, it'd probably be Liu Jianchao, who's the current director of the party's international department. So he's a ministerial level official. He's on the central committee. He was a career diplomat for the first big chunk of his career. He rose to assistant minister. He was ambassador to the Philippines and Indonesia. He's a fluent English speaker. He's actually at Chatham House just a month or two ago, giving an event there in London. He studied at Oxford as well, international relations for a year in the 80s. So, he's got diplomatic chops, but he's also had kind of an unusually political career in the last decade or so under Xi Jinping. So he worked in the old National Bureau of Corruption Prevention from 2015 for a couple of years. He was the deputy director there, and his role there was kind of to be in charge of Operation Fox Hunt, basically Xi's campaign to track down corrupt officials who'd fled abroad or who are alleged to have fled abroad with ill-gotten gains, and kind of get them back to China, get their money back. So he's being close to the heart of the anti-corruption campaign. Obviously big political priority for Xi, especially in his first term. He worked in Xi's old power base of Zhejiang province. After that, he was also in the Central Foreign Affairs Office, so that the office that kind of runs the business of Xi's Central Foreign Affairs Commission, which he leads, which is the main kind of policy coordination body for foreign policy, party body. It's not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a lot more important. So he was a deputy in the office there under Yang Jiechi, Wang Yi's predecessor, for 4 or 5 years, most of Xi's second term. So he's been quite proximate to the center of foreign policymaking during the Xi era. So he's a pretty strong candidate. There are others. Ma Jiaoshu is kind of the continuity candidate within the ministry. He is the ministerial level deputy director, so kind of the top ranked deputy under Qin Gang and now under Wang Yi. So he'd kind of be the in-house candidate, and he's very impressive experience, ambassador to the UN in both Geneva and New York, as well as a stint in Australia, my home country. But he's just not a particularly political animal in the vein of someone like Liu Jianchao, who's got like central party experience and provincial experience as well. And Liu Haixing is another name that might be in the mix. He's also a former diplomat, son of a former vice foreign minister, and has worked at the Central National Security Commission, arguably an even more powerful policymaking body for the last few years. So he's got political nous, he's got diplomatic chops, but he may kind of be too embedded in that security world that's a huge priority for Xi to be brought back to the world of diplomacy. There's a few other kind of senior diplomats or people in kind of foreign policy, party to party relations world who could be feasible candidates, but yeah, those 3 names are probably the top picks of who I imagine in the universe of candidates.
Thanks a lot, Neil, and we'll be keeping an eye on. Although, Chris, do you have any thoughts on this, or Rory, any final thoughts in relation to?
Just three quick points, I think. One, given what's just happened with Qin Gang, perhaps they'll want somebody a little more boring. And Ma Jiaoshu is a pretty boring guy, so that's interesting. Second point, Neil has just made a wonderful case for Liu Jianchao, and I agree with him. However, he made a perfect case for him under the rules that Xi Jinping enjoys breaking. So a lot of people sort of go straight to, well, he's a Central Committee member, so therefore, and it's like, yeah, just like you needed to be a vice premier to be premier, just like you needed to be a vice foreign minister to be foreign minister. Xi Jinping doesn't pay a lot of attention to this stuff, so he might surprise us. Obviously those roles he's been playing, though, as Neil laid out, are critical. There are issues of high interest to Xi Jinping, so he obviously makes a lot of sense. And then third point I would just say is that I'm really intrigued by what Rorry said about Wang Yi and the Taiwan role. I think that's very interesting. I suppose one challenge for him to some degree is that those very policies, the sort of early harvest policies and so on under Hu Jintao, those are exactly the things that Xi Jinping rejected with regard to his approach to cross-strait relations after meeting with Ma Ying-jeou, early in his tenure, when he sort of pressed Ma Ying-jeou on the issue of political talks, and Ma Ying-jeou said, no way. And I think Xi Jinping went back to his Politburo colleagues at that time and sort of said, look, this is the guy who's probably the friendliest guy we're ever going to get, and he's telling us no on our fundamental issue, political discussions. Therefore, we need to be tougher. So to what degree that sort of stink is on Wang Yi with regard to his approach toward Taiwan, I don't know.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Give the last word over to you, Rorry. What are some of the big thoughts you have in your mind as we look ahead and contemplate what's transpired over the last month?
Well, I think, on this last point that Chris mentioned, like, kind of a Taiwan hangover on Wang Yi. I think probably not. I don't think he would get foreign ministry position if there was a sense that retain, become an inner member of Xi's circle over these last 10 years, if there was a sense that the Taiwan issue was on him. I do think it's interesting, Chris's analysis of Xi Jinping kind of giving up on any political party in Taiwan. That tracks really well with kind of what I've studied about Beijing's take on Taipei over the last 10 years. But in terms of, who's going to be the next foreign minister, let me just make 2 points. One is that whoever it is going to have to take some time and build relationships, and having Wang Yi step in as an interim person does make that possible. So I would definitely be looking for senior Chinese officials who are traveling abroad as likely candidates for the next position. The second point I'll make, which is maybe a little bit more pedestrian, but I just want to remind everybody that this is a bureaucracy we're talking about, is that sometimes you make the decision about who becomes the next foreign minister based on whether or not you can replace that person at their current position. So, there's always the kind of curse of competence that might also come into play here. Perhaps Liu Jintao is exactly where he needs to be for Xi Jinping right now, and therefore doesn't make sense as a foreign minister. It does go to show you how little we really know about the inner workings of Xi's agenda. But personnel issues in a bureaucracy are often, decided on very complex terms and are not simply about finding the right candidate.
Thanks so much, Roy. That's a great place to wrap up. I mean, let's just say that, here at the Center for China Analysis, Asia Society Policy Institute, it's exactly this kind of work of trying to dig into this, fully aware that we don't have all the answers, but we're probably better off than most in getting to them and trying to provide them to the outside world just in this type of a format and elsewhere. So let me wrap up our discussion here, thanking our viewers and audience for joining us. We hope you found it useful. Please do be in touch with us if you care to follow up. And most of all, thanks to the excellent insights and contributions made here today by Rorry Daniels, Chris Johnson, and Neil Thomas. So thanks again, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all.
Thanks, Bates.